This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing, with discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, I am happy to welcome Holly Baldwin. She's a manager of quality validation and computer and CSV at Sanofi Pasteur. So welcome, Holly.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here.
Oh, it's so great to have you. And I loved your topic. So today we are talking about a robust assessment of third-party suppliers, but we're going to do it in a fun way. We're going to have a top 10 questions you should be asking your vendors. So I love that. What a great thought.
No, I thought that would be a lot of fun because it could be a rather dry topic. I think this is a fun way to do it and still get the point across.
And so we'll do the countdown. But before we jump into that, I just for our listeners, in a highly regulated life science organization, which many of them are familiar with, we know how critical it is to maintain data integrity and security. And it's a top priority throughout the life cycle of a product. And vendors, however, are not always up to speed on what we need of them as a regulated manufacturing facility, et cetera. So they may not have security as a primary focus, resulting in cyber breaches or other catastrophic events. And understanding, as the organization, understanding who has access to your data and how they define items such as validation, quality, and emergency change can be achieved by asking questions of your vendors prior to engagement. And that's really what got us going on this topic. But Holly, before we dive into the top 10 list, can you provide a brief overview of the industry today, in that the use of third-party vendors has increased, partially because of cloud technologies, as well as a growing need for specialized software and systems? So I'd love to get your thoughts and assessment of where we are today.
Sure. First of all, that's a great question. One of the things that I'm seeing more and more is people are going to cloud service providers, mostly in the software as a service, SaaS vendors, which is kind of like the flip side of that traditional IT software vendor that we had in the past. And I'm also starting to see learning management systems employing things like artificial intelligence,
right,
and things like that. So, the reason I came up with this subject is because I worked for a learning management system SaaS vendor for almost 2 years. And I was a bit concerned when I had life science companies come in and audit us or ask us questions, or because I was the validation person who had the most industry knowledge at the time there. So what happened is I saw that transition from that traditional IT model of purchasing software and installing it on your own data center to the cloud services. But it seemed like the life science companies, their quality system procedures and their audit procedures did not reflect that change. They were still working on past assumptions in that traditional IT model. And I'm also concerned that life science companies aren't performing a due diligence by selecting SaaS vendors through an audit before they sign a contract. And I think in your show notes, you're going to have a reference to that 2017 Q&A addendum to the
Absolutely.
21 CFR Part 11. I really encourage people to look at that. And I was also surprised there was an IBT event last year that a lot of people didn't even know about that was the first time the FDA talked about cloud service providers and what due diligence looked like.
Right. No, I know. And it's still an evolving area for a lot of life science manufacturers, because they have been slow to jump on that bandwagon, right? And use the cloud services themselves, let alone the SaaS vendors.
Exactly. And I think, too, it has a lot to do with the life science company's IT department or auditing department not having a thorough knowledge of what the cloud really means. Because
Right.
back in 97, it was like, oh, I heard the word validation, but until you really got into it to understand what it meant, you didn't really know. And I think that's the same thing when we're talking about cloud service providers.
Right. I think that's an important point because validation and compliance don't mean the same thing in finance or in other industries as they do in manufacturing. So it's really important for folks to understand not only what those things are, but what regulations apply to them and what's expected of them. So this discussion today around these 10 questions then, Holly, should help life science companies to do a better job vetting potential vendors, selecting those that are the best match for their intended purpose, and discovering whether they can leverage any of the vendor's documentation. FDA's draft guidance of computer software assurance outlines a lot of that. So let's dive in. And we're going to go backwards and make it a true top 10 list.
David Letterman would be proud, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So in the spirit of David Letterman, let's start with number 10, which is, can I perform a vendor audit virtually or in person?
Absolutely. This is a must. First, let me talk about the different methodologies of a vendor audit. You have a virtual, because now in this COVID-19 environment, that's probably the best way to go. You don't want to be sitting in a conference room with 15 other people. Or in person, which was, prior to January.
Right.
But one thing I stress, I really discourage life science companies doing is that questionnaire. And we all have them. If you've worked for any life science company, you have this standard questionnaire. How many employees do you have? This and this. Well, why am I discouraging that? I discourage that because questionnaires buy you nothing. In a virtual or in-person audit, you can say, you know what, show me that SOP on part 11. Show me how you do your testing. I want to look at your testing. You can talk to their subject matter experts, their IT infrastructure manager, their security manager, their QA manager, their directors, see if they're walking the walk and talking the talk, basically. Questionnaire. And I'll give you an example. When I worked for the SaaS vendor, we would get questionnaires all the time. And this was what Fortune 500 life science company sent us. Do you have an IT security policy? Well, of course, it's a questionnaire. So what did I write in? Yes, we do. Thank you for asking.
Exactly.
That's all I'm obliged to tell you. But if you ask me that in a virtual or in-person audit, I say, yes, I do. Let me get that for you and actually show you that.
Right.
Review it side by side. Hey, you know what? I can't answer that question. Let me get our security manager on the line. He's in our data center. Call him up. He gets online and expresses that. We can show him the testing we did. So again, and the one part about the vendor audit too, not only about the methodology, is when to do it. Please do it before you sign a contract.
Sure.
Absolutely. And you wouldn't believe, I would say out of the over 60 audits I sat in when I was with that SaaS vendor, I would say 2 performed it before they signed the contract.
Which is so crazy to me, right? I mean, we've been taught outside of this industry, but in general, we have been taught from, always like, don't sign anything, don't commit to anything unless you have read it all, unless you understand what you're getting into. So that's kind of silly. But just in a quick follow-up to that, so you're talking about the questionnaire and discouraging the completion of it. But I would say, as a life science company organization, you should, though, up front, I would think, have a list of things you want to cover with that vendor or that provider, so you can say, I expect to be able to see or talk about or discuss all of these X, Y, and Z. Yes?
Absolutely. And what the vendor should also do is have some sort of agenda up front that says, revise it as possible. Because too, if you're going to talk to subject matter experts, you want to make sure they're available.
Right.
And you can't say, well, I need you somewhere between 8 and 4 p.m. That usually doesn't work. But, that's working in conjunction with the vendor to say, these are our major topics that we want to cover. Is that covered somewhere in the agenda, or can you add it to the agenda? And can I talk to that subject matter expert? Things like that. But what I also heard at that IVT Cloud Computing Summit was that people who were using like infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, they actually were told that they couldn't do an audit. And so my thing with him, I said, well, that's why you do the audit before you sign the contract, because I would literally got up, shook the person's hand, said, well, thank you for playing, and walked out of the room.
Right.
But now
the list is long of folks that you can go to for these services.
Exactly. And because to me, what are they hiding? Why won't they let you do an audit? And now that you've signed the contract, you're stuck.
Right. I agree. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you for that clarification. Sure. We're going to move on to number 9. What kind of intrusion detection system does the SaaS vendor use?
Yeah. And some people are probably saying, well, why are you asking that? Well, the thing is data integrity, right? That's the overarching theme to part 11.
Right.
So not only do you want to know who from the SaaS vendor has access to your data, who can modify it if they shouldn't, but if they can, who does that? Who sees what, when, where, and how? But what if there's an intrusion? And we see this a lot. And that's why a lot of companies have decided not to go the cloud route, because they're worried about that. So this is a question you need to ask, because this question will actually stem more questions. And what other questions? It's like, okay, not only what kind of system do you have? Do you have different types depending on the attack modality? How are you alerted if there's an intrusion? You can have an intrusion, but if your detection system doesn't detect it and doesn't notify you, what's the point?
Absolutely. That's very important.
Yeah. How quickly is an attack circumvented? Again, I worked for a SaaS company. We had a hacker tried to get in from, I think it was North Korea or Iraq or something. Well, within, ready for this, 2 minutes, we had shut down all traffic from North Korea, Iraq, Iran, and Russia. Because we were notified, and literally it was in the middle of the night, and that's how quick our team was able to do it. So you want to know.
Response, Holly, but I'm going to assume not every SaaS provider has that capability.
No, but then you should ask, well, again, how safe is my data?
Absolutely.
And then 2, if you're going kind of on the other track of GDPR, which is the general data privacy regulation that the EU has.
Right.
Most SaaS vendors are compliant with that or have some sort of method to go into those different articles and how they do them. That's part of GDPR. It's intrusion detection.
Right.
And the next question you want to ask them, have you ever had an intrusion? If so, can I review the postmortem or CAPA created for that either attempted or successful intrusion? That'd be another question. How many successful?
That's a great question.
And then how do they know their intrusion detection is where it needs to be? Do they perform a mock intrusion testing? There are actually companies who do this for a living. That SaaS company can outsource that and say, just whenever, it could be 2 months from now, it could be tomorrow, it could be 6 months from now, try to access our system and see if we can pick it up.
Right.
So I said that I love that question because it kind of leads to like a cascade, a domino of questions that you can ask.
I agree. I think so. And I think you can learn a lot right there from that series of questions.
Yes.
Going to keep moving on to number 8. Where is the primary and secondary data centers? And I guess you're thinking of data recovery here, disaster recovery, and are either in a co-location site?
Sure. Let's tackle the first part of that question.
Sure.
So, believe it or not, I'm not sure if every SaaS company has a disaster recovery data center or a secondary one. So again, this is a domino question. This is going to lead, well, what's your RTO? Like, how long can an outage last before there's significant damage to our business?
Right.
Okay.
That's a
Right. I mean, you don't want somebody to hold your data hostage till they decide it can come back up or whatever, right?
Sure.
And then part of that is an RPO, which is the amount of time of data loss. For example, you can have a SaaS provider says their RPO is 15 minutes, which means that if an outage occurs at 9:15, they can restore data at to the 9 o'clock time frame. So you've only lost really 15 minutes.
Sure.
So that's one question you want to ask.
And so, Holly, when they ask that question, what should they expect, or what's the time frame? What's an acceptable time frame?
Well, I always say RPO should be, to me, no more than 15 minutes.
I was thinking, 15 minutes is even a lot.
It is. But I think that's more technology bias. You know what I mean? I don't think the technology is there yet to do any quicker than that. Not saying it couldn't be quicker than that, but and what I've also seen in a lot of vendors, now that I'm back in the life science white side, is that the RPO is longer than the RTO. I'm like, well, if the RTO is restoring the application and its data, what data are you restoring if you don't have the data?
Yeah, right.
How is that
even an oxymoron?
It is. And I'm like, no, that's it. And I said, well, explain it to me. You explain it to me like I'm a 2-year-old, why that's different. And the RTO, again, that could be a longer period of time. That could be anything from like, say, an hour to 2 hours, even 8 hours. It just depends on what the disaster was.
Sure.
And the other thing is too, between the primary and secondary data centers, how is that flow of information? Is it what I call hot backup, like that secondary data center within 2 seconds of an outage comes right back on? Or does there need to be some data migration, data mirroring? How often does that take place? So again, it's a domino question.
Right.
And then I know some people are saying, well, what's a co-location site? What is that? What co-location means is just a building that has many, many data centers from companies all over the place, right? So again, if Part 11 says data integrity, that people only have access to the system. Now, remember, the system involves hardware, servers. So who has access to your little cage site there? What security do you have there? Do you have like just a padlock? Do you have that anybody can walk into that caged area where all your servers are? Is there biometrics? Does the site have security? And we won't even discuss hurricane zones, flood zones, and tornado zones. What if the data centers are in one of those? What have they done that if something like that should happen, what do they know to mitigate that risk?
So it sounds like there's obviously a lot to consider.
Yes.
A lot of follow-up questions that they should be asking when they're interviewing vendors. Some of these things to me seem like they may be specific to the region or the country or the area that the vendor is in, or that their data centers are in. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like, for example, if you're in a hurricane zone, I would suspect that building should have some hurricane prevention, like can withstand a category 3, have concrete walls or whatever.
Right.
So it is definitely. And then if you have I hate to say, if you have a SaaS vendor in another country, that to me would even be more things you need to ask them so far as country security and data transport and things like that, how secure that is, that line of communication.
Right. I agree. Okay. Lot to consider there.
Yes.
Number 7, where and when is quality personnel in the validation process? And this is, again, a 2-part question: pre-approval, post-approval, and change management. So can you talk about, what the expectations are or the protocols are for quality personnel?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, I don't want the person from the SaaS vendor in the room who's kind of been trained to do audits. I want the quality person in the room to answer this question.
Right.
And if they're not available, we have a problem.
Quick response, right?
Right. Because I want to hear. And then again, show me the SOPs that guide that, where quality personnel come in and don't come in, what they're expected to do, how they review things, and then actually show me a pre-approval of a test. Show me a post-approval. Was there a deviation to that test? How did you do that? Especially in the change management. We're going to talk about that a little later on. Emergency changes,
right?
But you put everybody's teeth clenched down when they hear that.
You're starting to sweat.
Exactly. So you want to understand, how does quality do their job? Where they fit in the process, and do they feel that they have the authority to say no?
Very important. Yeah.
Exactly. Can they speak up? Like I said, when I worked for the SaaS vendor, I had no problem doing that because I worked in the life science industry for 20 years before that. So I had no problem saying, no, that's not the way this is going to work, and redoing SOPs and redoing quality events. But the thing too, you want to ask the QA person, and it's not mandatory, but I think it would be helpful to you as a life science company. Does any of your QA personnel, especially at the higher levels, have life science experience? I mean, actually worked for a life science company in validation, computer system validation, quality, any of those areas. Because I think then they have a better understanding what you need from them. They have a better understanding of the life science validation and quality process, so they can expect certain questions you're going to want from them, certain assurances you're going to want from them, quality agreements and things like that. So though it's not mandatory, I think it's really, really helpful if you have somebody who's an advocate for you as well on that QA team.
That's a great tip, Holly. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Number 6, how often does the SaaS vendor audit their offshore resources or third-party companies? And what are the consequences if offshore company fails an audit?
Absolutely. And that's, believe it or not, for the 60-some audits that I was in when I was at the SaaS vendor that I worked for, you know how many times this question came up? Once.
That's unfortunate.
It was because, believe it or not, when life science company would come into an audit, it would last 8 hours and we'd be so shot at the end of the day. But there were a lot of times at the end of that, they were like, I can't believe they didn't answer that. They didn't ask that question. I can't believe they didn't do this. They saw that. Why didn't that trigger a question? You know, things like that. So this was the biggest one, because you want to say, do you have offshore people who do like your programming?
Right.
If they do what they call follow the sun. So it's like, if we're sleeping here on the East Coast, we have somebody in India doing unit testing and programming and, you know, SAT and whatever they're doing over there.
Around the clock, yeah.
Exactly. Because if you have a lot of clients being a SaaS vendor, you're going to need that. You're going to need that constant work and changes and testing.
Correct.
So they should have an audit SOP. They should have a list of their vendors. And you're also going to need that if you have to also align with GDPR. You need a list of your offshore vendors, and they have to give it to whoever their clients are. The SaaS vendor has to give that to their clients as part of the GDPR articles.
Okay.
And again, how safe is your data? Who has access to your data? Can they change your data? I don't know. What's their work from home policy? You know, how often do you audit them? And can you show me any audit findings you had with them? Can I see their SOPs? Do they align with your SOPs, Mr. SaaS vendor? There's a lot of questions to ask them, but you have to ask this question and say, okay, show me where they had a major finding in a past audit, or do you have in your SOP, if they fail an audit and fail to mitigate that risk or do some changes to their quality hierarchy, what are you going to do with them? Are you just going to slap them on the hand and go, well, better luck next time? No, no. There has to be consequences. There has to be repercussions.
Right.
Because this is your data you're talking about. This is your system. The SaaS vendor may have physical access to your system, but in all essence, it is your system.
Absolutely. And you need to protect it like it is your number one priority, because it is.
Exactly. Flash, flash, flash.
Exactly. Question number 5. Does the SaaS vendor have documentation on their application programming interface, or APIs, including any existing application assessment results and reports that demonstrate security best practices and audit results? So you mentioned audit results a little bit, but this is where we really get into that.
Exactly. And again, out of the 60 some audits I went there, nobody asked us about our APIs. APIs, I hate to say, are a security risk. Think of APIs as kind of like a gateway, kind of like a firewall. And what hackers will do, they'll actually just keep trying to punch it. And when they finally get a little bit of sunlight in that API, they can have access to the whole system. So you have to be really careful. Like, show me, where do you use APIs? How do you use APIs? Who's programming these APIs? Can you show me security measurements that you're taking? What best practices do you have? Do you have testing of your APIs, and what are the results of that? Do you audit your APIs on a regular basis, like every time you do a release or add a new API or anything like that? How do you test them? And if there is an API attack, God forbid, how do you know? Believe it or not, a lot of intrusion detection is not considered for APIs.
And it's such an important question, because obviously the more APIs that they have, the more risk there is.
Absolutely.
For intrusion. And, we hear it's funny, because in every industry, and this is not exclusive to life science, in every industry, the majority of the time when a hacker breaks into, a major system or a major company, it's through a vendor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would say to all of the people out there listening to this podcast, go on Google, put in API hacking, and you will be shocked, which you find out. Because I know I was like, whoa, I never knew about this. It is eye-opening, but I think it's such an important question. And you're probably thinking, well, these are really tough questions. You want them to be tough. Why would you take it easy?
Right, exactly. You don't have to feel like, this is where you can take your customer service hat off and try, and not have to please the vendor. They have to really prove to you that what they have to offer is the best fit for your business and the most secure option for your organization, because you have to protect that data. Like, there is nothing else more important.
Right. And it's a little late after an intrusion has happened, or after, God forbid, a health authority comes and starts auditing and go, why, how is this data changed?
Right.
So, it is very, I think it's very important. I think, unfortunately, it's a missed item.
Well, that is why it's on the list, Holly. And we'll supply this list in the show notes as well. So it'll be available for download or viewing from our listeners. So don't worry if you're somewhere where you can't take notes. Number 4, discuss the alignment with GDPR Article 33. So if your company, as data controller, needs to notify supervisory authority in 72 hours, what is the time frame in which the SaaS vendor will notify your company?
Yeah. And again, this is important. You're probably saying, well, it's personal data. To me, this really reflects any data, but since GDPR is just about personal data, you want to ask the SaaS vendor, what's your alignment to GDPR? Do you have a white paper? Do you know where personal data is? Because remember, in GDPR, personal data could be your email address.
Absolutely. It's every single piece of contact information and personal information, including your name. And
it's amazing.
Right, exactly.
And SaaS vendors, what do they have? They have salespeople. And what do salespeople put in things like Salesforce, children's names? Oh my gosh, that's a big no-no. GDPR, anniversaries, your birthday, big red flag.
It might even be health information, right? So
absolutely,
heart attack such a day, or was out sick for whatever. I mean, there's like a lot of information that salespeople capture in their systems.
Right. And I also think it just demonstrates the due diligence the SaaS provider has done about knowing what kind of data they have, knowing how the data is controlled, knowing how the data is secured. So I know in life science, we always talk about quality by design. So with GDPR, there's two more things you can add by there: security by design and privacy by design.
I love that.
So you have to think about those as well. Even if your company doesn't have to align with GDPR, I don't know if it does or it doesn't. I think this is an important question to ask because you want to know, does the vendor know what data they have, where it is, and how secure it is?
Absolutely. I agree. All right. Question number 3. How will you be notified and how long before the implementation of the releases, upgrades, and patches is the notification?
Right. And I think the first part of that is when you sit down with a SaaS provider, they should have some sort of glossary. Okay. Because I always call it a lexicon because when somebody says to me user acceptance testing, I know what I mean. I don't know what you mean by user acceptance testing, though. So you want to ask for these definitions. You want to ask them, well, what do you define a release? What's the difference between major and minor?
Right.
There you go. What's an upgrade? What's the difference between a release and an upgrade? What's a patch? There's a lot of questions to ask them because then you know when that company says to you, we're going to do a release, you know what that means.
And you can ask up front too, how often they typically do these things, right? Because I know I've seen some vendors say, that they're releasing upgrades every 2 weeks. And that is a major challenge in the life sciences industry. That's too much.
Exactly. And again, I would be concerned because isn't an upgrade because a security upgrade? Is it,
Right.
What kind of upgrade? And why didn't you tell me this before? Because what a lot of SaaS companies will do is they will talk about major releases and then you are usually pretty much notified maybe 8 to 9 weeks in advance. You have opportunity to test. If you find something, they'll fix it and then you can retest. Where an upgrade, to me, sometimes that's a change that they're trying to get under the radar, for lack of a better term. But you can insist, say, I understand that sometimes there has to be patches that have to be done, an emergency thing, which you can notify me after the fact, but you better have a postmortem and a CAPA to back you up about why that was necessary.
Right. And that's the requirement for us as an organization. So then that has to be the requirement of the vendor.
Right, exactly. And then the upgrade is the same thing, or a minor release. Are you going to tell me or are you not going to tell me? Where do I get that? Sometimes I always think Microsoft, it's always a patch here or whatever. But always Microsoft, I got to admit, sometimes they back it up with documentation, like some sort of tech paper to say this is what the patch is. These are potential hazards to this. Why can't they do the same? I don't understand. But I think it's a question to ask. And again, this is a domino question. It's going to lead from one question to another.
Right. And of course, these questions are to help the life science organization better understand the processes and the protocols of the vendors they're vetting. And, they obviously then can weigh the pros and cons and make the decision that's best for their company, because even though these are important questions to ask, maybe the information that comes out in the discovery here is important, a priority for them, or maybe it's not, right? And they can make their decision based on that. But it's still important to make the decision with all of the best information in hand.
Right. And if you are doing this due diligence audit and you ask these questions and maybe they don't have the right answers, or maybe they don't even have an SOP around it, then that's what you put in your audit report.
Right.
Then you categorize it as critical, major, minor, whatever. Exactly. But then you give it to them, and just almost like what the FDA does to life science companies, you give them 2 weeks to bring it back to you to say, what are they doing to mitigate these major or critical findings? That could be that they're writing a new SOP, which they will give to you when they're finished. Maybe they're going to do things a little different. No company is going to be 100%, but you can kind of lead the charge into getting them that way.
Okay, that understood. Very good. Question number 2. What is the SaaS vendor's definition of an emergency change, and when is the quality department involved?
Right. Well, first and foremost, they should have a change management SOP where it's clearly defined. I mean, they can use any moniker. What's a standard change versus an urgent change versus an emergency change?
Right.
Because the last thing you want, and I know working for a life science company, and I was the change control master.
Standard in life sciences, right? So
oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, one year I did like 1,800 change controls.
Right.
And there would always be that one person because it was, 5 p.m. on a Friday and they forgot to do it earlier in the week, that they would try to get a quote unquote emergency change through because basically they forgot about it, and the business is yelling for it.
Right.
No, that's not an emergency change. That is not. And I would say, no, that's not it. Right. Well, you want to make sure the SaaS company's doing the same thing. That quality is involved. Quality makes that determination whether it's a true emergency change or not. Okay. Or an urgent change would probably be better because that means they still would have to test it thoroughly and anything before they put it in, but it's at a more expedited timeline. But an emergency change means they just kind of push it in there and, pray to the heavens that, they made the pasta and it stuck to the wall, basically, that it cleared up whatever the thing was. I mean, that should be the major exception to the rule and not the rule.
Okay.
Basically what you want. The second thing is, again, quality should have the final say. Ask where quality is involved, how quality is involved, and does quality feel that they can say no? I mean, like I said, I said no so many times, I should have just put it on my desk. It's just no. That they feel comfortable enough, and that IT and quality and programmers and third-party, they're all working together to make sure if this is an emergency change, it's the right thing to do at the right time and done the right way. And then when are you as a license company notified? If the emergency change requires downtime, or any emergency change, if you ask me, you should be notified. This
Absolutely.
Is what happened. Okay. This is why we had to do this. We've tested, there's no repercussions, but at the very least, if it's a true emergency, it should spawn at least a postmortem and more preferably a CAPA, because
Right.
you want to make sure whatever this emergency change was fixing, that's never ever going to happen again. Or did they, or did they put a pinky bandage on an arterial bleed? I don't know. But I certainly would want a CAPA to find that out. And
that's the only way that you can track it over time, right? So if it does happen more than once, then you have the trail that you can follow to kind of figure out, what so you can dig into the root cause, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I'm so glad you brought that up. I've noticed a lot of times, any vendor, their root cause analysis methodology is suspect.
I mean, that's not uncommon. I think even in the life science industries, a lot of organizations are not efficient in their root cause analysis, right? They're fixing some symptom rather than really figuring out what the source of the problem is.
Right. And I'm a big proponent of the 5 whys. If I've seen a lot of root cause, and they'll put something out like documentation was incorrect. So of course, what's my question? Why?
Well, why?
Why was it?
How did you fix it? Yeah.
Right. So you have not shown me the root cause. You showed me a symptom. Exactly. I still don't know what the root cause is. Yep.
Right. Precisely. And question number 1, Holly, for an unplanned system outage, when will you be notified? How will you be notified? When will you have access to the SaaS vendor's postmortem and or CAPA created for the unplanned outage?
Right. Because I don't think any of us want to try to log into a system and go, what? What's happening? Unavailable, whatever, unreachable, whatever. So stuff happens. I'm not saying it's never going to happen, especially if it's a hacker or an intrusion event. You want to shut down the system before anybody can get in. So if there's an unplanned outage, they should have some mechanism in either your quality agreement or your SLA that says, after an outage, you will be notified via this methodology at this time frame.
Sure.
Again, how will you be notified? Email, I don't know, fax, text, what,
right.
whatever.
Yeah.
Even a call from your salesperson, somehow you have to be notified. And then when will you have access to their postmortem or CAPA? Because, hey, if it's an unplanned outage, something unexpected happens. So you want to figure out what it is, do a root cause analysis, and do a preventative action. I see a lot of CAPAs that they're good on the CA part of it, the corrective action.
Corrective, yeah.
Not really big on the PA part of it,
Right.
preventative action. And with any preventative action, it has to, of course, dictate the corrective action and the root cause, but also there should be efficiency checks. Like, did the preventive action actually do what it was intended to do to stop it from ever occurring again? So we're going to check at 1 month, we're going to check at 3 months, we're going to check again at 6 months, and then we can close the CAPA. Yeah. And that way too, you can determine, was there any long-term effects of the outage? Or is there anything the corrective action or preventive action didn't have in there that it should have? So I think that's a great way. And again, when you do the audit, ask them to see their CAPA process, their postmortem process, and that, because then you can get a better idea about their methodologies.
Absolutely. And all of this information is important to the life science organization, in their audit trails as well. So it's all info they need. Great questions to have up front. Make sure you know what you're dealing with. So, Holly, it seems the bottom line here, now that we've gone through this list, is due diligence and research upfront to identify, as many suppliers of the products or services you need, then really narrow down the list to a handful of suppliers you can depend on. And I would assume this also includes consideration of items such as cost, customer service, flexibility, and scalability as your business grows or changes, and that they really understand your needs as an organization.
Absolutely. And that's what I said. I think it's really important that there's somebody in that vendor SaaS team who has worked for a life science company, because they can understand your processes better, understand sometimes what you're going to ask even before you ask it.
Right.
And that they've built that quality, privacy, and security by design into their organization. I think that would be a really large help for that.
I would agree. These are great questions. I mean, I know it's going to get everybody really thinking a lot harder before they enter into a contract with any of their vendors, right? And then not just SaaS vendors. This is great information. I mean, a lot of it's around data integrity and data security, but I mean, some of these are very appropriate questions to ask even non-SaaS vendors, just vendors in general. Know who they are, know what they bring to the table, and what it means to your organization. So I think this is such a thought-provoking discussion.
Absolutely. And again, I think the whole thing with the audit is to make sure your vendor is walking the walk and talking the talk. I mean, I agree. It's very easy to spout platitudes. It's a whole nother thing to actually show their process.
Fair enough. Well, Holly, we've covered a lot today, and I know that we are leaving listeners with much to think about. But before we wrap up, do you have any closing thoughts, tips, or advice for our listeners that you'd like to leave them with?
Sure. I think the first most important thing that I do actually when I go to any life science company is to take a look at your audit SOPs, your vendor audit questionnaires, your vendor audit team, to make sure they include cloud service providers. And you have that traditional IT model. It's worked very well for you, but now you have to think of the future, innovative technologies. You start to have to move your SOPs and your auditing methods more toward that, because you're going to see it more and more prevalent through the industry. And please if you don't have somebody on your audit team who understands cloud systems, again, everybody knows the word cloud, but do you truly know what it means? And any
your
risk
organization, especially.
Exactly. So have somebody, even who maybe goes to the audit team just for that one audit, who understands cloud systems, understands the inherent risks, and understands that these questions need to be asked. And please, please, please perform the vendor audit before you sign a contract.
Absolutely.
You have absolutely no leverage if you find any audits, if you have any major audit findings and you've already signed the contract. You literally have no leverage.
Yes. A very important point to leave everyone with. Well, thank you, Holly. It's been a pleasure to have you. I really appreciate you sharing all of this information with us today. And we will have links to the list and to some of the other references that you mentioned in the show notes for our listeners. I also want to give a big thank you to Ben Kitchen, our producer, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. We really appreciate the help reaching new people and spreading great information. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.